The redistricting wars rage on as growing numbers of states from Florida to California consider further gerrymandering in the wake of Republican moves to redo Texas's congressional maps.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is All Things with Kim Strassel.
Welcome to All Things with Kim Strassel. And this week, we're going to talk to a guy who knows a lot about redistricting, not just politics, but importantly, its legal and constitutional foundations and its longtime role in our republic. Welcome to Hans von Spakovsky, former member of the Federal Election Commission and senior legal fellow at the Heritage Foundation. Hans, thank you for joining us. How are you?
I'm doing just fine, thanks. And I appreciate you having me on the show.
Yeah, I'm excited about this because I can tell viewers and listeners, you're going to say some things that might surprise them. Okay, on the topic du jour, or rather the topic de August, all redistricting all the time, as most everyone knows by now, this all kicked off when Republicans moved to redistrict Texas midway through the census cycle, even though Texas already had its congressional map, with the goal of adding about 5 more Republican seats. Democrats melted down. Governors like California's Gavin Newsom and New York's Kathy Hochul vowed to respond by drawing their own maps. This has now provoked Republicans to double down themselves. They're now looking at Florida, Missouri, Indiana, and the trench warfare is going on. I want to actually spend most of this podcast talking about some important bigger issues about gerrymandering and redistricting. But just quickly, Hans, from an immediate political perspective, where do you see all this headed?
Well, folks need to understand that there's no law or constitutional provision prevents Texas from midterm redistricting. Any state can do that if they want to. They just haven't in the past because it's a lot of work to go through the redistricting process. What I haven't seen mentioned, Kim, much is that the incentive for this was actually a warning letter from the Department of Justice. And the warning letter was over the fact that at the end of last year, the Fifth Circuit U.S. Court of Appeals, right? That's the appeals court that has authority over both Texas, Mississippi, and Louisiana, said, oh, you know what? We made a mistake 40 years ago when we said that the Voting Rights Act protects, covers, and requires what are called coalition districts. Coalition districts are districts that are not what are called majority-minority districts. You know, a district where perhaps Black voters are a majority. Coalition districts are where they can't find enough racial minorities to fill up a district, so they combine 2 different groups, like a group of Black voters and a group of Hispanic voters, so they become a majority. Well, Texas in 2021 thought they had to comply with that. So they drew up 4 of those coalition districts. Well, what the Fifth Circuit said is, that's a political alliance. You know, that is not protected under the Voting Rights Act. And therefore, Texas, when you drew up those districts, you were engaging in unconstitutional racial gerrymandering. And what they meant was that what was the primary factor they used to draw up the boundary lines? It was race. Yeah. And you can't do that. And so Texas is now trying to fix that. And in fixing that, it's going to create what? GOP favored districts, because what were those other districts supposed to do? Elect Democrats.
Yeah. No, and we're going to talk some about how the Congress and courts have really made this issue more complicated in ways that you just mentioned. But you make a really good point about what Texas is doing here, in that it is essentially attempting to help the Republican Party because it's currently in the hands of Republican legislators. And, you know, gerrymandering, or this process of cutting up voters into districts in ways that favor one political party or the other, it's become a bit of a dirty word in our political language. Not everybody knows exactly what it is or exactly how it works, but there's this general view these days that it's bad because it equals this base partisan effort by one party or the other. I have read a lot of your writings on this, and you make the point that gerrymandering is in fact envisioned, that the founders knew that politics would play a part in the process of drawing boundaries, but gave that power to state legislators anyway. And you moreover note that telling those legislators that they can't even consider politics would, and I quote you here, destroy a fundamental element of our democratic system, end quote. That notion is going to blow a lot of minds. So explain.
Yeah, I mean, the whole reason we have the word gerrymander is because the first time it happened was in 1812. I mean, we've had this for our entire history. And the word comes from Elbridge Gerry, who was the governor of Massachusetts, and he drew up a district that looked like a salamander. So they combined that to come up with gerrymander. And what the Supreme Court has also said about this is, look, redistricting is a political question, a political issue, and it's part of the hurly-burly of politics. It's the political parties battling each other in the political arena and in the world of ideas. And there's nothing unconstitutional about it. In fact, Kim, as you probably know, the Democratic Party actually went all the way to the Supreme Court just a couple of years ago, trying to claim that political gerrymandering was unconstitutional, even though they've been doing it for a very long time. And the Supreme Court said, it's not unconstitutional, and we are not going to make decisions about that because it's a political question. And what I would say to people, if they don't like what's happening in a particular state, well, if the legislature is the one doing it, then work to unelect and get those people out of office. That's the solution to it. Or the other potential answer is push the legislature to put in very strict rules.
Right.
Very strict standards on compactness, contiguousness, not breaking up county governments and cities as much as possible. That's how you do it.
Well, I think you make a really good point that it's not impossible to both understand that there will always be an element of politics involved in this, but to also expect those engaged in the politics to have common sense in the way they draw these districts. As you say, to have tight, compact districts, ones that maybe follow set boundaries like mountain ranges or rivers, ones that rather than these kind of ink blot maps that we get these days. You actually make the point too that there's actually some good arguments why you don't want to try to keep politics out of redistricting. And people forget that as much as we like to suggest there's all these nefarious people sitting in a room coming up micromanaging the data, this is a bit of an inexact science. You've got a very mobile society where districts change quickly. Sometimes voters split their tickets. You don't really know how that's going to work. Also, there's a tension between trying to shore up the security of your districts versus creating more, which maybe dilutes your power in more districts. I mean, there's a lot of reasons why this can boomerang on plenty of the people that are engaged in the districting, right?
Yeah, that's true. And particularly because, look, most states, as we were discussing, they do redistricting right after the census, right? Within a year or two. By the time the next census rolls around, 10 years later, those districts, the populations have radically changed in many places because we're such a mobile society. Take Texas, where the current fight is going on, right? They redistricted in 2021, but Texas has had the fastest growing population in the country. They've added over 2 million people since those districts were drawn, which means that those districts now, which are supposed to be equal in population, well, they're obviously not, because that huge increase in population has obviously distorted those districts.
Does your view change on this at all then, given what might be a move toward more mid-decade redistricting? I mean, is there a risk that some of these points or calculations change if essentially legislatures are meeting on a constant basis to re-update their maps to most benefit them?
Well, yeah, that's a potential problem. But what was interesting just recently when the president said he wants to do a mid-decade census
Yeah.
is I actually checked the U.S. code, right? That's the list of federal statutes. And it turns out, I don't think a lot of people know this, that in the 1970s, Congress actually passed a law amending the census statute to provide for, guess what? A midterm census.
And is there any special reasons for that?
I couldn't quite find out why they did it, but I suspect it was because of the fact that they knew that we are one of the most mobile societies of any of the Western democracies, and populations change very, very quickly. And, why not do a census every 5 years instead of every 10 to try to compensate for that? Particularly also because, remember, the census is a key to how much money states get from the federal government. There are many federal programs that are based on your population. And if you're waiting 10 years for the census to take into account your huge increase in population, you're not getting federal money you otherwise probably should be getting.
Fascinating. We are in new political times. I want to ask you about another element to this. So Democrats are racing to attempt to redraw some of their lines, and their effort is going to be more complicated than most of the Republican efforts. And that's in part because of this bad reputation gerrymandering has out there. We've seen this new phenomenon, especially in the last 15 or 20 years, where you've had these states adopt these independent redistricting commissions.
Right.
And the notion is that they will be fairer and nicer and better if we outsource this line drawing to a group of supposedly nonpartisan figures. Numerous states have these now, although Democrats are threatening to sideline most of them as part of this redistricting thing. Your thoughts on these independent commissions and how they actually work in practice?
Actually, just a couple of years ago, I took a look at the congressional districts that the so-called Independent Redistricting Commission of California established, because California is one of the states that did this. And I compared it actually to, guess what, Texas. And it turned out that this supposedly Independent Redistricting Commission had engaged in greater political gerrymandering than the Texas Republicans had.
Yep.
So this idea that these independent commissions will somehow come up with these clean bills without politics it just doesn't fit reality. And there's two things about it. One, who gets appointed to them? Right? State legislators and governors appoint the members. So they're all going to be people who are politically active, and they have no accountability. Like I said, if the state legislature, if you don't like what they've done, you can try to vote them out of office. Yeah, that may be hard, but you can at least try to get them out of office, and you may succeed. When people are appointed to these redistricting commissions, if you're voters and you don't like what they've done, there's nothing you can do about it.
And convenient, right, too, because Californians can say, oh, look, you don't like those maps. And we didn't do it, even though, of course, they did do it because it's all their partisan actors engaged. But it's a kind of a hand washing exercise in my mind. I also read a great piece saying that you end up having two kinds of commissions, one that are stuffed with partisans, right? So they're essentially doing the dirty work of the party, or ones that are actually equally split, which deadlock all the time. And then usually at which point the legislature steps in and does a partisan gerrymander anyway. So it doesn't seem like they're accomplishing much.
No. And actually, I'll tell you something else I found out from personal experience. Some years ago, when the California Independent Redistricting Commission was first getting set up, a lawyer I know in California called me because, they needed to rely on experts, right, to gather the data and to draw up the proposed maps. This lawyer called me and said, well, here are the lawyers who they've hired to do this. What do you know about them? Well, I knew every one of them because every one of them were all these very liberal lawyers who were essentially allies of, guess what? The Democratic Party. And these were the experts hired by this independent commission.
Yeah, an additional problem, right? It's not
Right.
even just the elected members of the commission, but all their staff, et cetera. Another phenomenon we've seen is Congress and federal courts getting in on this
Right.
Gerrymandering and Redistricting Act. And you set us up really well by mentioning one of the big laws out there that has really thrown monkey wrench after monkey wrench into this process. This was Congress getting involved. Give us a brief explanation of the provisions in the Voting Rights Act that affect gerrymandering and redistricting, and how that has left us with a bit of a mess.
I will tell you, this is a very confusing area of the law, and it's particularly confusing for state legislators because they have two cliffs in between that they have to walk. I call it the Goldilocks rule of drawing political districts. Under the Voting Rights Act, you cannot discriminate on the basis of race. Now, look, that law was passed originally to stop what was going on in the South, right? Black Americans were being kept from registering. They were being kept from voting. That kind of misbehavior, that's all gone. But what started happening in the late 70s and 80s is that folks started saying, well, that provision that prevents racial discrimination also prohibits diluting votes. So we're not talking about anyone being kept from voting, but supposedly their vote is diluted if they can't elect their candidate of choice. What all of that boiled down to was that Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act required states to create certain political districts called majority minority districts in which a racial group that is a minority in the state has a district or more than one district where they may be a minority in the entire state, but they're a majority of the voters in that particular district so that they can, if they vote cohesively, they can elect their candidate of choice. Now, the problem is that the Supreme Court has also said, well, okay, race may be one of the factors you can use under the Voting Rights Act, but you can't have it be the prime main factor. If you use race as the main factor when you're drawing boundary lines, well, then you have violated the 14th Amendment of the Constitution, the Equal Protection Clause, one person, one vote. And all of this came out of a case out of the Carolinas in the 80s, where in order to create a Black majority district, the state legislature created a district that looked like a barbell. They took two large areas in entirely separate parts of the state and connected them with an interstate highway. And the Supreme Court said, you can't do that. Race was clearly the main factor you used to draw that district. That's racial discrimination. So all these legislators are, well, they're supposed to use a little bit of race, but they can't use too much race when they draw these lines. And the problem is you can have two judges look at exactly the same set of facts and come to exactly opposite conclusions on that. And that's what causes so many cases to spring up in the litigation area.
Well, you just brought up the next question, which is courts increasingly are just the arbiters of all of this.
That's right. Yeah.
And, there have been some lines set. The Supreme Court did put out a ruling for a while saying that the courts that were outlining maps purely on the grounds that they were partisan couldn't do that because this is basically the court ruled that this is a political activity. Right. You don't get to sort of override the judgment of the political actors. More recently, the Supreme Court has been chipping away at some of this Voting Rights Act questions. Where do you think that heads in the next couple of years? Because I mean, we've got what at the moment? Louisiana's being heard again this fall
Right.
over a case that's been going on for a while. There's been litigation in Georgia. This is just a constant merry-go-round for the court of these redistricting suits.
Yeah, in fact, Justice Alito actually complained about that. They're getting so many redistricting cases going up to the Supreme Court, and it's because the area of the law is so confusing. That Louisiana case you just described actually shows the problem in this area. Because what happened in Louisiana was they, out of their congressional districts, they had one that was a majority Black district. And they did redistricting, they maintained that district, and Black voters came in and said, oh, well, you discriminated against us because you didn't create a second Black majority district. And we deserve it. Why? Well, because we're about 35% of the population of the state. Okay. So a judge agreed with them and said, Louisiana, you have to draw up a second district. So they did that. Well, they got sued again. But this time they got sued by white voters who said, when you drew up that second district, you did it entirely based on race. Therefore, you violated equal protection. So they had two different courts saying two different things to them. And that's the case that's going to be reheard by the Supreme Court in the fall. And Justice Thomas has said, this is a real problem, and that race should not be allowed at all in redistricting because that violates equal protection, the one person, one vote standard, and it's discriminatory. So I think the fact that they said, we're not going to make a decision this past June, we're going to rehear arguments in the fall, says that they're giving that serious consideration.
Well, wouldn't that make sense to you? I mean, we've now had a Supreme Court, and I think it was John Roberts who authored decision to say the way to stop discrimination on the basis of race is to stop discriminating, stop making decisions on the basis of race. And Justice Thomas, as you mentioned, have noted that in our increasingly pluralistic American society, it actually becomes very difficult to even decide who is a majority or a minority based on where you're standing in the country, right? There are plenty of places in America where whites are the minority. And if we continue to go down this road, wouldn't we assume there's going to be more litigation, not less? Wouldn't this be consistent with where the Supreme Court seems to have been headed in general on race?
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. And quite frankly, look, the best thing that could happen in states to try to prevent that kind of litigation is that when they get population data that they're going to use for redistricting, it's entirely without any racial data.
I absolutely love that suggestion. And on that wonderful advice you just gave, we're going to take our leave. We want to thank you, Hans von Spakovsky, for coming on today. We want to thank our listeners for tuning in. If you like the show, you can hit the subscribe button. And if you'd like to write to us, you can at atkim@wsj.com.